Hello. I was assigned Chapter 11, Cookbooks for the Rich and Poor. This chapter discusses the history of the differences in cookbooks in relation to social status. The thesis of this chapter is that the availability of food has depended on social class for centuries, and cookbooks reflect this social division. We're going to start with an introduction. Chapter 11 begins by telling us about two foreigners in Victorian England who wrote books that acknowledge the connection between food and social class. The first was French-born Alexis Soyer, a successful member of British high society. He was the chef at the prestigious Reform Club in London, and he was involved in charitable work. He's remembered for writing cookbooks aimed at different social groups. He wrote his breakthrough book in 1846, The Gastronomic Regenerator. It was written for cooks employed in upper classes, but it was divided in two parts, the kitchen of the wealthy and the kitchen at home. In 1848, he published Charitable Cookery, or the Poor Man's Regenerator. He kept the costs low and included recipes for soups, puddings, and stews. He donated a portion of the profits to charity, and he established soup kitchens in Ireland. In 1849, he published The Modern Housewife for the Growing Middle Class, and he published A Shilling Cookery for the People in 1854 for artisans, mechanics, and cottagers. Friedrich Engels also wrote about the connection between social status and food. He was a young German man who came from a wealthy family. He was interested in Karl Marx, and he was upset at the living conditions that he witnessed for the English working class. In 1845, he wrote that the amount of meat products in the average diet diminished with every step down the social ladder. And he said that the Irish were at the bottom of the ladder and they ate nothing but potatoes. Now we're going to talk about codifying social differences. Noecker says that social level stratification goes back far in history. Good food has long been a privilege reserved for people of higher rank. You can find this information on page 188. I consider this to be one of the three most important passages in the chapter. In the very early works of literature, we heard that noblemen consumed game birds, white bread, and wine, while farmers consumed boiled veal, and the unfortunate slave consumed coarse bread and thin gruel. Noecker tells us about detailed rules that restricted the diets of the different social classes. For example, the count in a Bavarian household in the 1500s was served 8 dishes, while the members of his council and his ladies were served 6 dishes. The members of the clergy, gentry, and marshals were served 5 dishes, and other employees were served only 4 dishes. In France, an ordinance in 1336 actually fixed the dinner menu, and less pie was served to people as they went down in rank. A cookbook from the Renaissance period also supports this trend. But as the middle class gained financial power, they began to eat food and wear clothes that were previously reserved for royal nobility. This was upsetting to the elite, and they passed new laws to limit excessive consumption of luxury goods. King Henry VIII limited the number of dishes that were served at court according to rank, and the Swedish and the Danish adopted similar laws, sometimes limiting or even forbidding artisans and servants for buying gifts of marzipan, a treat made from imported almonds and sugar. A popular Russian cookbook from the 1840s confirms that certain foods like noodles and cabbage was considered suitable for servants, but not those who were considered more important. The point of all this is that cheap products belong to the lower class and they were denied the luxury items. Now we're going to talk about from royal cookbooks to the popular cookbooks. As more cookbooks were published, publishers came up with titles aimed at certain markets because they wanted to make money. Cookbooks planned for different markets have different recipes because cookbooks are first and foremost commercial products. You can find this information on page 191, and I consider this to be one of the three most important passages in the chapter. Beginning in the 1700s, more cookbooks were written for middle-class households that were headed by a female cook. A book printed in 1710 that presented itself an example of the grandeur of the English court did not sell. So 6 years later, the publisher released a successful new edition that featured cheaper dishes. A strong division between middle-class cookbooks and lowest social groups remained, and the distinction was made clear in the cookbooks of the 1700s. And we're going to talk about language and typeface. We have to remember that not everyone could read in the 1700s, and much of the early printed literature was in Latin. Fortunately, cookbooks were written in common language very early on. But even so, there was a great difference in literacy among Europeans, and it took a long time before much of the population could read the cookbooks. As literacy became more prevalent, cookbooks for the middle class featured a Gothic font, while the Roman font was used in cookbooks for the upper class. The Roman font was considered more difficult to read for the less literate. A Finnish cookbook in the late 1800s was first published in Roman type, but 2 years later, they published it in Gothic type since it was primarily intended for cooks and service. A question of price. As time went on, all books, including cookbooks, became financially accessible to more people. Cookbooks were sold along with storybooks and almanacs by traveling peddlers during the 16th and 1800s, but these books often cost an entire day's salary for a worker. The price of books was one barrier, but the other barrier was the price of the food itself. The most expensive cookbooks featured the most expensive ingredients. Sawyer, the French author who we spoke of at the beginning of this talk, used 106 different ingredients in his cookbook for the elite. He used 90 in his book for the middle class, and he only listed 76 ingredients in his cookbook for the lower classes. And of course, the ingredients in these books were also divided by their cost, so that the lower class cookbooks featured the cheaper ingredients. Sawyer even gave fancier names to the same dishes according to class. The elite's recipe was called portage à la cresse, and the middle class recipe was called cresse soup or puree of carrots. And the lower class recipe was simply called red carrot soup. In one upper class cookbook, an author offers 8 elegant recipes for sweetbreads or brains. But in his book with cheap recipes, he only says that sweetbreads are inexpensive products. We're going to talk about games, wild game, and substitutes. Nodeker goes on to say that throughout these times, game was among the most high-ranking of all meat. The attitude has to do with the old aristocratic privileges of hunting. In 1800s France, poultry was considered such a high status that imitations were made from veal or even beef or pork. Sugar was also substituted for because it was very expensive. So then we're going to talk about the horse and worse. Also in 1800s France, campaigns were made to substitute meats with horse flesh because the lower class was not getting much meat and there was a surplus of horse meat. But this met with resistance because the church banned consumption of horse flesh in the Middle Ages. Still, a rare cookbook did mention horse meat. In any case, horse flesh was never made successful entry into the cookbooks. Now, alarmingly, a recipe for roast cat meat is in a Spanish cookbook from the early 1500s. And during the siege of Paris, a cookbook gives a short description of how to boil rats to make them safe to eat. Another uncomfortable fact that Nodeker mentions is that the privileged ate animals from the city's zoo during the siege of Paris. A menu from Christmas Day during the siege advertised elephant bouillon, roast camel, bear cutlets, kangaroo stew, leg of wolf, and terrine of antelope. So to conclude, Nodeker said that today's cookbooks are not explicitly aimed at different social groups, the rich or the poor, but the choice of ingredients in some books may indicate that they are destined for a more affluent segment of the population than just the average person. You can find this information on page 200. I consider this to be one of the 3 most important passages in the chapter. I hope that you enjoyed my summary. If you have any questions, please let me know. I'm attaching a transcript of my video, and we need to note that portions are paraphrased or either quoted directly. Thanks again. Hope you enjoyed it. Goodbye.